Now, deep mapping has been defined by various people, including Bodenhammer, Corrigan, and Harris here, as a set of methodologies for dealing with place in the kinds of materials humanists deal with. So, text, images, performances, all of these sorts of things. And I believe it was, in fact, in this book by Bodenhammer, Corrigan, and Harris in 2010, an edited volume, which first coined the term spatial humanities itself. So, Bodenhammer, Corrigan, and Harris talk about, fine detailed multimedia depiction of place, people, animals, etc., simultaneously a platform, a process, and a product. So, a deep map is essentially something that is done rather than produced. Another definition, more recent one, is by Roberts in the introduction to a special issue on deep mapping and spatial anthropology, in which he stresses the interdisciplinarity of deep mapping, of this sort of set of methods for dealing with, expressing, and analysing place. He calls it a coagulation of approaches and interdisciplinary interventions put performatively to work. Again, this idea that a deep map is something which is done rather than produced, unlike, say, a GIS model, which is something which is just sort of done, produced. Now, I think it's interesting to start with the question of why these authors would be concerned about this. And my view is that this has arisen from a dissatisfaction with geographic information systems as a means of dealing with the very complicated, reflexive, recursive material that we as humanists deal with. Mapping is an easy thing. Well, it's an easy thing. It is a methodologically relatively straightforward thing if you have data which lends itself to mapping, to quantification. Humanities data does not always do this. So there have been these works coming out which have sought to think about, what alternatives to GIS we as humanists might have if we want to understand place in our materials. Now, why does this matter? I mean, I like to sort of illustrate this with this image that I took on holiday last year in York, up in the north of England, and this is Stonegate, which is one of the main shopping streets of York. And the reason that I find this interesting is because if you look at the Roman layout of the city, there's the stone gate there. This actually corresponds to the Via Principa of the Roman fortress. And the city has kind of evolved around it. So, to put it another way, this is a street that has been in continuous human usage pretty much every day for 1900 years. It has a very deep, rich spatial history, which actually GIS approaches really can't capture. So these kind of embodied, descriptive, analytical approaches of deep mapping is the kind of thing which, this is the kind of problem which I think that Bodenhammer, Corrigan, and Harris and Roberts have in mind when they talk about this set of reflexive methods. Deep mapping is also about communication, about communicating space and communicating place. And this is something which it is not at all easy or even possible to do in an objective manner. Any map that we use is value-laden. It contains and encodes the intentions and prejudices of the person responsible for the map. And then we kind of engage in a almost in a conversation with that person when we use a map. And so this is a cartoon used in a book from 2006 by Linda Hill, which kind of illustrates the sort of complexities of expressing spatial information in kind of recursive, textual, human communicative form. Now, this kind of subjectivity and communication of place and in the deep understanding of place is really what makes a landscape a landscape. So that is to say, a landscape as opposed to, for example, a hill in the distance with some trees on it. It only becomes a landscape when it is understood as such by a human viewer. And I think that's what these definitions of landscapes, which I put up here, are all about. It's a kind of, in this case, it's a painting representing an extensive view, natural scenery, etc., from the Dutch. So, again, a sort of landscape is a way of conceptualizing place. It's a way of sort of interacting with it as a sort of a human viewer. And landscapes have been extremely important in the history of archaeology. As James mentioned in his introduction, I started out as an archaeologist. I was very interested in how we kind of understand landscapes. And this is a sort of set of methods which was very important to a branch of archaeology, theoretical archaeology, called phenomenology. And phenomenological archaeology was pioneered by Christopher Tilley in this extremely famous book that he published in 1994, a phenomenology of landscape. And his central thesis in this book, or Tilley's central thesis in this book, is that we can only truly understand a landscape or any kind of environment if we physically experience it ourselves. In Tilley's view, the understanding of landscape is an inherently human, subjective process. It's a process of embodied experience, of embodied almost reading of the landscape. Now, this was, and still is, an extremely controversial position. It sort of kicked back against decades of archaeological thought which insisted that landscapes, and particularly places, had to be reductive, had to be viewed objectively, had to be quantified, had to be mappable in order to be scientific, in a sense. Tilley said, no, we don't need to be scientific, we don't need to be objective. The whole purpose of, or rather the whole raison d'etre of understanding a place is our personal connection with it. Now, personally, I agree with some of this. I always like to hedge when I talk about phenomenology and whether I agree with this or not. I think it is highly problematic in some regards. And a point that has often been made in response to Tilley's ideas is, well, if I go to Stonehenge, for example, there is no way I can have a personal or cognitive connection with the Neolithic and Mesolithic people who built Stonehenge. So this whole idea that we could only understand the landscape of Stonehenge by being there, by experiencing it, well, what does that tell us about the past? Tilley's view is, as I've said, that there are certain kind of irreducible points of contact between the self and the landscape, and so there is a kind of thread, sort of, which goes atemporally through the whole of human experience. But anyway, it all comes down to this idea that I was talking about before, about what is mappable, what is quantifiable, and what is not. And I think a lot of the material that we as humanists deal with sort of falls into the category of not being easily mappable. So the question arises about how we actually interrogate this information. Now, another aspect of this, of course, is the political aspect. If space and place is something which is subjective, which is kind of experienced and communicated, this leads on to the question of how we, as human beings, collectively understand place. And this has informed a lot of thinking of scholars such as Doreen Massey, the Marxist geographer who died last year, I believe, who wrote a very, very famous article in 1991 called A Global Sense of Place in Marxism Today, in fact, in which she put forward the view that place is not a concept which can be meaningfully mapped. Human place is not a concept which can be meaningfully mapped and quantified. Rather, it is a concept which is constantly subject to competing impetuses. It is being constantly, excuse me, made and remade as as people interact with it. So this, for example, is a room. It has 4 walls, a floor, and a roof, but it is given meaning as a place by the fact that we have all come here at a particular time for a particular purpose to interact in a particular way. And again, that is not something that can be easily expressed by any kind of a geographical information system or a map. And in fact, the act of mapping that space would be an act of ownership, of control in a way. And so it's this idea of kind of the bottom-up conceptualization of space versus space which is mapped from above. This is also the case in imaginary landscapes. And I keep going on about sort of material that we as humanists deal with. Well, one example of this, and I know we have literary studies people in the room here, so I'll be a bit careful as to what claims I make. But one example of this is the Wessex of Thomas Hardy. Now, Thomas Hardy's novels draw very, very intensely on the landscape of present-day Devon and Dorset. And novels are in fact set there. He changes place names in order to give himself the sort of literary freedom to develop his plot lines within that spatial context. But of course, Hardy's Wessex might have begun in the mind of Thomas Hardy, but it is replicated every time anyone reads one of his books. There is an act of engagement with the landscape when anyone consumes that material. So, and again, this is something which conventional mapping really can't capture very easily at all. I think this is another source of that kind of dissatisfaction with conventional geographic information systems that Bodenhammer, Corrigan, Harris, and Roberts were talking about. Another nice example which I like to give when I'm talking about this is the London of Sherlock Holmes, which is an extremely kind of famous, evocative, sort of literary landscape. If you say Sherlock Holmes' London, you immediately think of sort of swirling fog and gaslights and shadowy figures ducking into alleyways and so forth. And this is something, I know you can't read this, it's too small, but I just want to sort of highlight the fact that in the stories there are, of course, numerous specific spatial references to present-day London where the names haven't been changed. But this is an example, rather an exercise that I set my students when I'm talking about mapping literary texts. Because when you are dealing with, this is the Strand here in the Lyceum Theatre, so it's local to King's, which is why it's quite a nice example for me to use for students. This is dealing with the kind of gentrified area of central London, but when they, in their hansom cab, go over the bridge to Rochester Road, Vincent Square, Vauxhall Bridge Road, Surrey Side, etc., this is where London starts becoming disreputable, dangerous, a kind of hangout of criminals and so forth. So Conan Doyle here is using London and different contrasting areas of London as a kind of plot device to increase tension. Now, of course, the Sherlock Holmes phenomenon does not end with Arthur Conan Doyle. There is a whole industry in present-day London given over to Sherlock Holmes. There is, of course, Benedict Cumberbatch. In the contemporary series, there are different ways in which Sherlock Holmes is sort of transmitted and understood, and how the London of Sherlock Holmes is transmitted and understood over time. And this is kind of remade by every generation. So once again, you know, the question comes up as to how we might interrogate, what methods we might use to interrogate and understand that kind of literary, mental, unmappable space and place. Now, this brings me to the section of my talk where I want to talk about chorography, because I think that it is with chorography that we first start to see a meaningful attempt to engage with these human unmappable places. And the reason I think this is so interesting is I think if we look at the work of the chorographers, and I'll come on to who they are in a second, this really does give us a window into the roots of the spatial humanities as we know them today. So this is, as I say, an idea I've been working on for the last couple of months now in various depths of the British Library. I've been sort of poring over these 16th and 17th, 18th century tracts that these people wrote. And I just want to share some initial observations with you this afternoon on this. So, the chorographers are generally taken to begin with John Leland, who was born around 1503 and died in 1552. And these were writers utilizing the exciting new high-tech world of print publishing to explore and express place in new and quite innovative ways. So Leland himself was the cartographer royal to Henry VIII. He went mad and died in the later stages of his life. And he was commissioned. Oops, that's gone on too quickly. And around 1538, he is commissioned by Henry VIII to undertake an inventory of the libraries of the monasteries, which Henry VIII had his eye on at this point. And so Leland undertook this laborious journey and search, so obviously before the days of proofreading. And he travelled all around England and parts of Wales, inventorizing or creating inventories of monastic libraries. But he also peppered his writings with observations about the places he went to, and the journeys he undertook. And in the 1901 edition of in the preface to the 1901 edition of the Laborious Journey, the editor, Lucy Tormins Smith, says notes that he seems to have noted down his facts on the spot from local inquiries, and then sort of wrote it all in at his leisure later, creating this narrative from his own memory. So this, I think, is one of the first, well, essentially it's the first travel writing, the birth of travel writing that we're talking about here. So it begins with the skeleton of a page of place names, so things which can be easily mapped, and then sort of begins filling in more reflexive, discursive narrative around that. So I think this allows us to kind of trace the beginnings of the tension between that which is mappable and that which is not. Oops. Now, another chorographer, slightly later, is Dr. Peter Heylin, who was a priest, in fact, who is remembered mainly for his cosmography in 4 books containing the chorography and history of the whole world, principal kingdoms, provinces, seas, and isles. And actually, Heylin is quite an interesting character, really. And I rather like this this extract, which I found in the initial introduction to his work. He says he he encountered in his passage from Westminster to Whitehall by a tall, big gentleman who, thrusting me rudely from the wall and looking over his shoulder on me in a scornful manner, said in a hoarse voice these words, "Geography is better than divinity." Okay, I mean, this is a slightly beguiling image, these ruffians stalking the streets of 18th century Whitehall, forcing people to become geographers. But this needs to be seen in the context of this introduction, which really is a really good whinge, in effect, about the privations that Heylin had been subjected to in his life. To understand this, we need to note that he was, in fact, a very kind of high church Anglo-Catholic who had been abused by the Puritans for these beliefs. And, you know, the whole first 5 pages, these are large pages, are given over to complaining about his treatment. And so this geography with menaces kind of comes in the context of this ill treatment that he received. But what does, I think, is quite interesting about this is the sort of the purity and the quality attached to the concept of geography as a subject. Now, why might Heylin have gone out of his way to describe this strange incident in his lament about his lot in life? Well, I think to understand the reasons for that, we need to go back an awful lot earlier, to classical Greece, in fact, and to the works of Claudius Ptolemy of the 1st century AD, who distinguishes between chorographia, which is a description of the land, the politics of cities, states, and people, versus geographia, which is the kind of mapping in a quantitative sense of landscapes which cannot be seen by one person at one time, so beyond human scale. And I'm not going to read all this word for word, but in his introduction to his work, which is called the Geography, he distinguishes geography from chorography in this way. So again, chorography is that thing which is seen, described. Geography is that which is mapped beyond the level of human scale. But interestingly, and I think this is where Heylin is coming from in his work, Ptolemy describes geography as a subject of fairest and most sublime contemplation because it is quantitative. It corresponds to the notion of a mathematical ideal in a way that chorography does not. And I suspect that this is why Heylin had his assailant say that geography is better than divinity. We have this kind of this distinction cropping up there. And I also just sort of note that Ptolemy is the first person to develop methods for establishing absolute coordinates by observation of the sun at different times of the day. So he established a table of real-time coordinates of real places from which a lot of subsequent mapping was derived. Well, I'll come back to that shortly. And he is also the inventor of the sundial, or the gnomon, because the length and angle of a shadow of a perpendicular stick at midday allows you to calculate the position of the sun, which is how he derived his coordinate table. So, going back to chorography of the 17th and 18th century, it is in a sense continuing and developing this tradition which separates the mappable geography from the describable, which is chorography. But what I think is interesting is that in this period, the distinction becomes somewhat blurred in some publications. So in Ellis's English Atlas, for example, published, excuse me, didn't put the date on there, did I? I think this was 1680, I believe. Is described as an atlas or a complete chorography of England and Wales in 50 maps from the latest surveys corrected and improved by the best authorities. Now, I think that Ellis is using the term chorography in a slightly different way here. In this, he is simply extending it to mean a detailed description of, in this case, a large area. So this is developing the Lelandian view of chorography from something which is observed in the human present to simply a detailed description of a large area. And this is something which also comes through in the third chorographer I've been looking at, William Camden, author of the Britannia, which was first published in 1562, I think it was, but republished in numerous forms for many decades and centuries after that. And I actually heard an interesting conspiracy theory meeting yesterday that Camden was actually working for Charles II on a survey of sites for ordnance, for cannons. I don't quite know how that came up, but there we go, maybe something to look into. But Camden is best remembered for his Britannia, which in many ways extended the methods and the techniques of Leland and Heylin and those who were working at the same time. And in some of his works, Camden also seems to seems to refer to chorography in this idea as a description of a whole area. So, for example, in the introduction to his edition of the account of Richard of Cirencester, that isn't a typo, that is how it is actually spelt in the original. He describes Richard of Cirencester as an invaluable curiosity to the inquiries into Roman Britain. He gives us an exact and copious chorography of the whole island. So again, I think we have a sort of evolution of the term, a kind of collapsing of the sort of the idea of scale that distinguishes chorography from geography. But what is interesting about Camden's approach is his introduction and his focus on antiquities. And this, I think, is a really interesting link between space and place and a glorious classical past. I just wanted to put this in because Camden also used Ptolemy's coordinate system to plot his map of the British Isles here. So, as you can see, it's a little bit out, but it's a little bit of a link there. And Camden sort of develops this idea, this link between space and past in his Britannia, where he says that Britain's the most ancient people of this isle, anciently inhabited, the same from sea to sea, whose valour and prowess is renowned both in Latin and Greek monuments. So, again, we have Camden here making this very explicit link to a sort of glorious classical past, which is sort of coming through in an emergent national Elizabethan present. And he also very much anchors himself to traditional church teachings by describing man as being the very image of God and a petty world within himself. So again, there is a sort of link between the human persona and a national persona. Camden also famously described Hadrian's Wall, which is worth kind of mentioning. He describes it as being called by ancient writers Valum Barbaricum Praetentura and Clausura by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the Murus or the Picts' Wall. And what we have here is, again, this very nationalistic description of what is essentially a military frontier. So, again, we have the idea of a nationalistic association with all these sort of classical military allusions. Now, Camden's description influenced numerous subsequent writers on the subject. We see this kind of nationalistic description reflected in the words of Theodore Mommsen of 1885. Also, John Collingwood Bruce, who, continuing the travel writing theme, wrote essentially the first travel guide to Hadrian's Wall in 1886. So this whole narrative of sort of division and defence and frontiers sort of really comes through from particularly the work of Camden. Now, one of the things that I think is most interesting about all this, and this will sort of tie into my conclusion when I get there, is that both Camden and Heylin make reference in their works to the difficulties encountered by the medium of publishing when it comes to publishing maps. And essentially both felt that it would make their works prohibitively expensive if they included a lot of maps in them. And I think it's actually really interesting that they should go out of their way to say this in their introductions, or rather, I should say, this introduction to Camden isn't Camden's words, but the words of the editor. I think what this tells us is that we are seeing the emergence of chorographical writing and thinking about space in a subjective way, but they are struggling with scale. They are struggling with the means of communicating those communicating those images of place in a visual sense or in a written sense. And I think this kind of brings me on to that other aspect of deep mapping I was talking about, which is the idea of communicating space. So an example I like to show of this is if we take a place such as Chesil Beach on the south coast of Dorset, which is described in Camden's Britannia, incidentally, Portland here, the Isle of Portland on the end here. It's interesting to show this in the context of a map drawn by a 4-year-old of Chesil Beach, which essentially was done after a visit. So what this shows is the arrival. Obviously there's some schematics of stones here, and then just an end. So I think this really sort of encourages us to think about, what it means to simply describe and communicate a place based on personal experience. Okay, so where this is all sort of going to be going is to the idea that sort of the internet and GIS has essentially beguiled us away from the complexities of describing place. I'm going to say a bit more about that in my conclusion. So just to sort of now bring in my own sort of chorographical research case, I'm going to talk a little bit about some research I've been doing on corpse parts, which I've been doing in parallel with this work on chorography. Now this is, as I say, just not even really a project, it's just sort of research strand I've been pursuing sort of by myself. Now, corpse parts are, essentially refers to the belief that the pathway taken by a funeral party from the place of death to the place of burial acquires certain properties, mystical properties in a way. So it's essentially a set of folkloric beliefs. And it is alluded to in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, when Puck soliloquizes, "Now it is the time of night when the graves all open wide, everyone lets forth its sprite in the churchway paths to glide." And I am sort of interested in this as a spatial problem for what it tells us, about beliefs around death, but also about what it tells us about, for example, the growth of the influence of the church in the medieval period. So churches become powerful because they insist on people being buried in their churchyards. They charge fees for that, which means bodies have to be borne often over countryside, which kind of gives rise to this this set of beliefs. And I've actually been developing a catalogue of documented corpse parts, mainly in the British Isles. But all I've really been able to do is identify start points and end points. I found it's really, really difficult to actually identify the paths themselves. So I've been using sources such as this. This is an article published in 1928, which refers to one of the beliefs around corpse paths, which is that any path taken by a coffin party actually becomes a public right of way in its own right, which is apparently completely not the case. But I was intrigued by the theory that I read in this article, which is that the idea of corpse paths come from what's known as beer hulks, which are strips of fields, the edge of a field left unploughed expressly to allow the passage of funeral paths. And there is also an allusion in one of the responses to this article, because they published correspondence, to one quite near me from the village of Littleworth in Oxfordshire to Farringdon over the fields here. And I wondered if it was possible to sort of tie up some of this thinking about chorography that I've been reading about in my research into Leland, Camden and Heylin, and to see, if there is anything that could be brought to bear on this very sort of nebulous feature of the landscape. So there are various clues. There is a public right of way over the fields, over these three fields here. It is named Church Walk, which is a clue in its own right. But what particularly intrigued me was these two sets of hedgerows right here, just outside the village of Farringdon. And it struck me that this was actually consistent with the idea that the edge of a field had been left deliberately to allow the passage of coffin parties coming from the direction of Littleworth. Now, I bring this up because this is exactly the sort of problem that we do not tackle with GIS. The reason being, the evidence is incredibly intuitive, it is incredibly fragmentary, it is incredibly difficult to conceptualize in terms of simple points on the map. Well, I mean, one can, but one really does not get very far. And this has sort of made me realize that splitting spatial data, or data which captures the human experience of the world around us into vector and raster digitized files, really, I think, almost does a disservice to those kind of highly reflexive, highly discursive notions of spatial experience. And I'm just going to skip through this last bit to try and show you what I mean. Another sort of project I've been working on in this area has been actually in the East Mediterranean, where I have been working on documenting places mentioned by a man called George Jeffrey, who wrote itineraries on the island of Cyprus. And what I've been experimenting with using GIS is essentially looking at what you could see from each of the places that Jeffrey mentions. So these blue areas are areas which are visible from these points which are mentioned in Jeffrey's narrative. And, I think this gets us some of the way to understanding what this text might say. But essentially, it really does it really does sort of constrain our sort of thinking about what Jeffrey's experience of that place was. And I'm not sort of come here to sort of diss GIS, and I think I'm going to start sort of wrapping up a bit now. And I always like to sort of fall back on this quote from Agnieszka Leginsky, who is a geographer who has worked heavily with qualitative and quantitative GIS, where she talks of the conceptual errors and semantic ambiguities of representation in the infological world propagate and assume materiality in the form of bits and bytes. And this goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning about the idea that certain forms of data lend themselves well to quantitative mapping that others do not. So I'm going to finish by asking the question that I posed in my title, can deep maps be digital? Well, in my experience, the humanities have done a lot of great things with GIS, but if we look to GIS, Geographical Information Systems, to try and further research agendas, I think that really is not going to work. Essentially, GIS and the digitization of place allows place to be communicated easily. You know, it allows place to be communicated instantly. Think of Google Maps, think of Google Earth, all of these online digital maps which shape our lives and our activities. That's what digital mapping is really, really good at. I think if we are going to move beyond that to what Bodenhammer, Corrigan, and Harris and Roberts, those quotes that I opened with, talk about deep mapping, we need to start engaging not just with analytical functions of GIS, but the spatiality of the internet and the web itself. We need to think about, you know, what we sort of do with digital data, what we do with our devices, and you know how that kind of impacts on our sort of on our ways of doing things. I know also, just to sort of sum up a little bit more, I think if we sort of look back at the kind of distinctions between the chorography and geography that we saw in the Elizabethan period, you know, in the work of Camden and Leland, etc., you know, I think that's a really useful sort of distinction to keep in mind when considering, you know, what GIS can and cannot do. So, I think I'm going to finish there. Any questions? Questions?